of a manipulation on these objects, they're basically assuming that they're actually measuring the object. This raises two questions that I want to address in my talk today, namely, where do the psychological concepts originate from that inform such operational definitions? And what is the ontological status of the objects thus investigated? Briefly, my answer to these two questions is that psychological research is informed by folk psychological concepts and targets objects individuated by those concepts. For example, research about memory relies on the conceptual assumption that memory involves processes of learning, storage, and retrieval. And it is precisely these processes that scientific psychology tries to elucidate. I will argue for the following three theses. First, folk psychological concepts individuate their objects at what I call the whole organism level, i.e., as cognitive behavioral capacities. Second, folk psychological kinds, that is, the objects that correspond to the psychological concepts, have a robustly real, though not immutable, status as distinct from the entities that make up their realization basis. And third, when conducting scientific investigations of a given cognitive kind, researchers exploit precisely those conceptual and causal assumptions that sustain the kinds in our folk psychological practices. So that's a lot that I'm just kind of throwing out there, but I hope some of it, or maybe all of it, will become clearer by the end. In the past, in my own previous work, I've argued that operational definitions are tools of research. Given that research aims at improved concepts, we may say that they are also tools of conceptual development. This raises the possibility of thinking of conceptual development as a process of explication in Carnap's sense, i.e., as a process of, I quote, the transformation of an inexact pre-scientific concept, the explicandum, into an exact concept, the explicatum. Where, and I quote him again, the explicandum may belong to everyday language or to a previous stage in the development of scientific language. The important point for my purposes is that the original concept allows us to identify the object under investigation, but as a result of the research, the reference of the original concept may shift or become more fine-grained. To get this process more clearly into view, I draw on Georg Brun's helpful distinction between the task of clarifying a folk concept and subsequently explicating it in the course of theoretical development or theoretical progress made in a field. Operational definitions are constructed as part of the former project, the clarification. They highlight and clarify salient assumptions that we have about our research objects and help us cast them into a form that is manageable in an experiment. So the act of clarification is crucial to the design of the experiments that may or may not result in an explication of the concept in question, where by explication I mean in the Carnapian sense, basically an improvement, a different concept, but then one that is still connected to the previous one, but better. So given the assumption that concept explication can result in better concepts, the question is by what standards a concept can be said to have improved. One strong intuition surely is that a concept is improved if it better captures and describes the corresponding reality. But what is the corresponding reality that psychologists hope to capture with their kind terms? My thesis is that the reality that the scientific concept of psychology hope to capture is and should be precisely the reality individuated by the folk. While an adequate reconstruction of the research must also allow for the possibility that the folk can sometimes be wrong. So this is kind of a tension that I want to explore. I will proceed to the first part of my argument, namely that cognitive kinds are complex cognitive behavioral capacities and that the correct way of individuating such capacities is constrained but not determined by non-psychological facts. It is widely assumed that when we sort the psychological domain into kinds of things, there are some non-psychological facts in the world that uniquely determine whether we get it right. For example, within the tradition of eliminative materialism and philosophy of mind, we find the assumption that neuroscience is likely to deliver a verdict as to whether our psychological vocabulary maps onto real kinds of things. This raises the question of what neuroscientific findings would have to look like in order to be able to do that. One clear-cut view about this is encapsulated in traditional identity theory, according to which psychological kinds are real if and only if they're type identical with neurological kinds. In turn, the corresponding psychological kinds are typically understood as propositional or experiential mental states or as functions. A clear formulation of the idea that cognitive kindhood is settled by neural facts was provided by Carl Craver's non-dissociable realization principle, according to which, I quote, instances of a natural kind have one and only one realizer. If there are two distinct realizers for a putative instance of a kind, there are really two kinds, one for each realizer. Polgar and Shapiro also appeal to this principle as part of their argument against multiple realization, suggesting that whenever we find brain mechanisms associated with the same cognitive kind, we would automatically have to engage in kind splitting. This way of individuating cognitive kinds makes sense in the context of a traditional cognitivist picture of psychological explanation, whereby the explanandum of such explanations is behavior to be explained by appeal to internal cognitive entities, such as pain or beliefs. Such internal entities, then, are what traditional philosophy of psychology makes out as the targets of psychological kind terms. But there's also another influential way of thinking about cognitive kinds, which is associated with Robert Cummins' idea that the explananda of psychology are not behaviors, but capacities, which are the targets of what Cummins calls functional analysis. Functional analysis explanations will likely appeal to the totality of mechanisms and phenomena that can account for the capacity. I argue that the flip side of this is that it is the totality of mechanisms and states, including mental states, that make up the capacity and thus the cognitive kind in question. In a similar vein, Jackie Sullivan suggests that the neuroscience of cognition aims at the discovery of, I quote, natural kinds of cognitive capacities. So that's exactly what I'm talking about here. Let me also clarify that my specific version of rejecting identity theoretic positions about cognitive kinds does not rely on a multiple realization argument. This is because once we individuate cognitive kinds as complex capacities rather than as individual states or functions, it becomes clear that the cognitive kinds are, as Khalidi has pointed out, at a different spatio-temporal scale than the realizing mechanisms. Now, of course, even if we were to agree that the relevant cognitive kinds are cognitive behavioral capacities, it does not follow that the folk necessarily has an accurate understanding of those capacities. So this gets us right back to our earlier question of what facts in the world might settle whether our folk concepts of cognitive kinds are accurate. One way to go from here might be to say that even if cognitive kinds are not strictly identical with neural mechanisms, there might still be neuroscientific facts that uniquely determine the correct way of sorting the cognitive domain into kinds. One contender for this line of thinking is obviously Richard Boyd's homeostatic property cluster theory of natural kinds, according to which natural kinds are property clusters that accommodate objective structural features of the world. This account is attractive for our purposes because it captures my contention that the kinds of psychology are spatio-temporally extended clusters of phenomena and mechanisms, while allowing for the fact that one of those mechanisms might settle the objective identity conditions for the kind. Boyd's account acknowledges that we have epistemic criteria for individuating kinds. For example, in the case of cognitive kinds, behavioral criteria, while suggesting that there are also ontic facts that fix the identity conditions of kinds. In the following, I will follow an argument by Carl Craver to suggest that there is no straightforward way of identifying the non-psychological mechanisms that would or might unambiguously and uniquely determine cognitive kindhood. Craver starts out with his own previous assumption that scientists split and sometimes lump their classificatory categories in accordance with what they find out about the world, specifying that the relevant mechanisms might be brain regions, cells, proteins, or organisms. But then in response to the question of how mechanisms might be sorted into or be relevant to specific kinds, he raises two problems. The first concerns the question of how to choose between multiple mechanisms that might be taken to underwrite any given kind. And the second question concerns the issue of how to individuate even one particular mechanism. As it turns out, neither of these questions has an easy answer. Thus, Craver remarks, I thought I had the quote up here, but I don't, so I will read it. Most putative kinds are entangled with myriad mechanisms. By attending to some of them, one is led to lump. By attending to others, one is led to split. With regard to his second point, and in an argument that is reminiscent of Bechtel and Mundale's point about levels of abstraction, Craver points out that one and the same brain mechanism, e.g. the hippocampus, can be described at different levels of abstraction. Each of these descriptions serve unique epistemic purposes, and thus it is unclear how one might argue that one such description is objectively pitched at the appropriate level of abstraction and gets at the real kinds. Craver thus concludes that human perspectives and conventions enter into judgments about how mechanisms should be typed and individuated. There's the quote. Now, if there's no objective basis for taxonomizing kinds of mechanism, then clearly there's also no objective structure for using mechanism kinds to taxonomize cognitive kinds. A similar argument is also advanced by Eric Hochstein in a 2016 paper where he maintains that the assumption that there is a single ideally correct way of classifying or categorizing mental phenomena and that neuroscience and psychology should adhere to this correct scheme runs counter to productive scientific practices in these domains. Taking an even more radical stance, Samuli Pöjönen argues that it is not even clear that the kind-fixing mechanisms need to be intracranial, i.e. neural mechanisms. For example, within an extended cognition approach, one might have a conception of memory that involves reference to, say, clay, paper, or computers. Pöjönen argues that insofar as we can identify an underlying mechanism for this way of individuating memory, this is completely compatible with the HPC, i.e., Richard Boyd's theory of kinds. One possible conclusion from the argument thus far is that there are no cognitive kinds, if by kinds we mean something that is settled by non-psychological facts in the world. Another possible answer or conclusion or implication is that there is a plurality of real kinds. In the following, I want to endorse this latter possibility. Discussions about criteria that settle kindhood are often run together with the issue of whether the kinds in question are real. This issue is often understood in one or both of the following ways. Namely, either as meaning that the entities in question have a mind and practice independent status, and or as meaning, secondly, that descriptions of macro-level kinds can only refer to something real if we can make out a microstructural basis. Based on the discussion in the previous section of my paper, it seems clear that cognitive kinds don't meet either criteria of reality. Does it follow that they're not real? In response to this question, I wish to challenge the two criteria of reality just mentioned to argue that there is no reason to suppose that reality requires mind independence, and that while macro-level kinds certainly cannot violate microstructural facts about the world, this is at best a necessary condition for their reality, but not a philosophically interesting insight about what makes them real. Let me start out with the first point, to say that the assumption that reality requires mind or practice independence is clearly false, since human-made artifacts are obviously real, even though their existence depends on us. And likewise, the existence of colors depends, among other things, on the observer, but it does not mean that they're not real. Indeed, the fact that colors, for example, are central to the way in which we regulate traffic suggests that they are capable of making a causal difference in the world by virtue of being integrated in our practices. And as I will say in a moment, I think that's enough reality for my purposes. I take the case of colors as a model for my relational account of cognitive kinds to argue that such kinds, qua macro-level kinds of cognitive behavioral capacities, come into being at the interface of our sensory-conceptual apparatus on the one hand, and structural features of the physical world, including the brain, on the other. And they're sustained by our causal and conceptual practices. With this move, I take up suggestions and debates about what it means for social categories to be socially constructed, and in what sense socially constructed categories might be real. Ron Mallon contrasts social role kinds, such as gender and race, with biobehavioral kinds, where the latter, but not the former, have a basis in some objective feature in the world. The basic idea is that while kinds like race have no objective basis in some biological, e.g. genetic facts, they're nonetheless real in that they inform our reasoning about and practices with regard to people of color, which in turn solidifies the social reality and harmful causal effects of this category. However, as we've just seen, even in the seemingly clear-cut cases of biobehavioral kinds, such as memory, the situation is less clear than would appear at first sight. So how can we account for the reality of such kinds? To answer this question, I adopt and adapt the notion that socially constructed kinds are sustained by concept and conceptualized practices, where on my account, those practices include causal practices and their effects. I argue that this position can be extended to cognitive kinds. For example, if our concept of memory has something to do with encoding, storing, and retrieving information, this will not only inform our reasoning about it, but also kinds of practices, including practices of experimental investigating memory, but also everyday practices of teaching and testing. We make assumptions about cognitive kinds all the time, and they have a causal impact on our behavior. I have just pushed back against two common assumptions as to what makes an entity kind real, namely that they have to be mind independent, and B, that it is identity conditions, that the identity conditions of a kind are determined by microstructural facts. But beside the anti-realism worry, there's also a second worry, namely that we might end up with a multiplicity of quote-unquote real kinds. This possibility has been wholeheartedly endorsed by some. For example, John Dupre suggests that what counts as a kind is radically context dependent. In the context of the economics of fishery, whales might be classified as fish, whereas in the context of biological taxonomy, they would not be. Dupre is not worried about this kind of pluralism, which he cheerfully calls promiscuous realism. In his own words, I quote, "According to promiscuous realism, there are many, perhaps very many, possible ways of classifying naturally occurring objects that reveal real divisions among the objects." I would like to highlight Dupre's usage of the word possible here, to emphasize that we should distinguish between the question of the plurality of real kinds that are possible in a given domain and the question of how much pluralism we are in fact going to encounter. If, as I have argued before, real kinds are sustained by conceptual and causal practices, it follows that the reality has to be relativized to the context of these practices. For example, the correct level of abstraction to describe the hippocampus is determined relative to the specific scientific aims and practices, but does not necessarily have any bearing on many conceptual causal practices outside the neuroscientific lab. On the other hand, if we think of the kinds of folk psychology, they have a much larger domain, because the causal and conceptual practices associated with them are much more widely shared. They have a reality in our folk psychology, and that's why we want scientific psychology and neuroscience to enlighten us about them. Notice that I'm not committed to the idea that cognitive kinds of our folk psychology are universal. In fact, I take it to be one of the attractive features of my analysis that it can accommodate the possibility of cross-cultural differences, as has been suggested by Kurt Danziger, as well as the possibility of cognitive kinds changing, as has been suggested by Ian Hacking. But how can we be wrong? But if our folk kinds are created and sustained by our conceptual and causal practices, how might we account for the possibility that the folk could be wrong about these kinds? I have two responses. The first is that just like in the case of race, a kind can be real, but we can come to be critical of the conceptual and causal practices that sustain it. For example, we may have a conception of memory that strongly suggests rote learning as an educational tool. Even if these educational practices are causally efficacious, and thus the kind real, we might have reason to revise our concept of memory in accordance with more progressive teaching methods. This highlights the fact that the question of whether the folk gets it right can involve normative and descriptive questions simultaneously, which is a point that Ingo Brigantes recently made. And therefore, questions of how to correctly kind the world involves or can involve challenging causal and conceptual practices, both on descriptive and on normative grounds. In addition, researchers can also individuate a capacity, a folk psychologically individuated capacity with folk psychological kind terms while having an inadequate functional analysis of the capacity in question, which can later on be corrected. I have suggested that folk psychological kinds come into being at the interface between our sensory-conceptual apparatus and the world, and that they're sustained by our conceptual and causal practices. In the previous part of my talk, I explained the latter of these 2 points. How are they sustained? I now very quickly turn to the former point, and I explain its relevance to experimental practices in psychology. My thesis that cognitive kinds come into being at the interface between our sensory cognitive apparatus and the world fits with a proposal that Thomas Radin recently made, according to which kinds, and notice he's not restricting this to cognitive kinds, kinds are co-creations of humans and the physical world. But what is it about the human conceptual perceptual apparatus that allows it to latch onto the world in such a way that kinds get created? My answer is that in our everyday folk psychological practices, we individuate behaving organisms as meaningful units. In other words, we don't observe meaningless behaviors and then wonder what internal entity might have caused it and might be explanatory of it. Rather, we see organisms moving around in and responding to complex environments. And we posit kinds to describe those capacities, the capacity to move around and to respond as a whole. And that's the basis of our folk psychological kind terms. I don't have a lot of space to go into the details of this account here, so let me just highlight that it fits with early and mid-20th century ecological approaches to psychology, such as the Chicago School of Functionalism, associated with people like John Dewey, as well as Gibson's and Brunswick's theories of perception and behavior, and Tolman's molar behaviorism, according to which the relevant unit of psychological analysis is the sensing and behaving organism in a complex environment. When it comes to the question what it is about our sensory cognitive apparatus that enables us to pick out entities in this way, in the way I've outlined here, Corinne Block-Mullins has recently offered an interesting account of concepts as similarity, or what she calls a similarity-based analysis that draws on the structural alignment view of similarity by Markman and Gentner. The basic idea is that things get sorted into kinds based on similarity judgments, which are heavily context and foil dependent, and which are governed by lawful regularities. This suggests that similarity is flexible, while also that it's not arbitrary by virtue of being underwritten by perceptual laws. If we apply this framework to the ways we attribute cognitive kinds to behaving organisms, we do so not on the basis of some decontextualized movements, but by taking the environmental stimuli into account. And this is basically why we can only by taking the environmental stimuli and the behavior into account do we arrive at a notion of cognitive kinds as complex cognitive behavioral capacities. So we individuate the behavior of organism as instantiating cognitive kinds in this kind of holistic manner. And I realize that this is actually, I'm really waving my hands here, but just to give you a flavor of what I have in mind here. Let me conclude by arguing that it is precisely the way in which we individuate cognitive kinds on the whole organism level that enables researchers to design experiments to experimentally investigate cognitive kinds. Cognitive behavioral capacities rely on environmental stimulation to be actualized. And needless to say, their actualization consists in cognitive and behavioral phenomena. Within the context of experimental design, it is the task of experimenters to simulate what are assumed to be typical environmental conditions, to measure what are assumed to be typical behaviors indicative of the cognitive kind under investigation. My analysis has two crucial implications. The first is that experimental designs inevitably have to rely on folk psychological assumptions about the relevant object of research. And this is what I was talking about right at the beginning of my talk, where this is how the operational definitions come in as being derived from folk psychological concepts. And the second implication is that the experimental stimuli and responses used in psychological experiments are not mere epistemic vehicles by which researchers try to access the cognitive kind that is somewhere inside the cognitive apparatus. Rather, experimental stimuli and responses are chosen because they're taken to instantiate phenomena that belong to the very kind under investigation. We cannot isolate capacities experimentally without making assumptions about typical conditions that trigger their actualization and typical phenomena that occur when they're actualized. I want to briefly mention that even though I focused on the kinds of psychology, my point might be taken even further to argue that folk psychological terms inform or ought to inform not just psychological research, but also certain areas of neuroscientific research. A suggestion to this effect has been made by Jackie Sullivan in an article where she argues for what she describes a cognitive notion of mind. And just kind of because I'm realizing I'm running out of time here, I'll just quote her to say, quote her article where she says, folk psychological constructs serve as a basis for designing experiments to study the cognitive capacities of interest. Putting this in my terms, cognitive systems, qua whole organism phenomena, are embedded in and intentionally directed towards environments, and this is captured by our folk psychology. So with this, I'm at the end of my talk, just to summarize, I've argued that cognitive kinds are cognitive behavioral capacities that come into being at the interface of our sensory cognitive apparatus and the world, and are sustained by conceptual and causal practices, and the physical conceptual and causal practices. With this, I have highlighted the importance of folk psychological concepts, both for the reality and for the scientific investigation of cognitive kinds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the downsides of webinar is that we can't really clap, but the heart is here. So let me remind you, if you've got a question for Uljana, I'm opening the floor now. We have a bit more than, we have between 10 and 15 minutes before moving to the next talk. Write your name in the Q&A box by clicking on the bottom at the bottom of your screen, and I will move you from attendee to panelist. And it takes a few seconds for that transition to happen. All right, we have a first question coming right now. Charlotte, the floor is yours. Please turn your mic on and the camera on.
Yes. Hi. Sorry. Sorry about the hassle. Thank you for the very insightful talk. And could I just interpret your thesis first and see if you agree? Because I sort of thought of it as kind of a Wittgensteinian approach to late Wittgensteinian approach as to incorporate cognitive aspects and meaning in terms of use and conventions. And for me, it also gets into the enactivist theories of cognition, if that's correct.
Sorry, I didn't realize you were done with your question. To be honest, I mean, I'm really intrigued by both of these suggestions you make, and I'm taking notes. Yes, I do think that there are some connections to the enactivist approach, which I kind of became aware of at a conference I attended a couple of years ago, but I'm not that familiar with that work, so that I wouldn't be able to spell it out at this point. But I do recognize, especially with the maybe the kind of ecological side of that I developed towards the end of my talk, that there might be a good fit there. And similarly for the Wittgensteinian aspect, you might be right. I might contact you later and ask you to tell me more about it. I'm just not a Wittgenstein scholar, and so I don't want to commit to that, but it sounds like that might be the case.
Sorry, don't worry. It's only my interpretation. My question will be really brief. So okay. So since you mentioned the mind-body problem, there's a commonly used notion of supervenience around the mind-body problem. I personally think is often presented as stronger than it seems, because I think supervenience has more of a neutral function. That is, it's very mind-body problem neutral. So if the identity theory is correct, it maps the the mental to the physical. If dualism is correct, it maps the mental onto itself. If eliminative physicalism is correct, it maps the cause structure onto itself. So I wonder if that's compatible with the pluralism you suggested. Supervenience, that is.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I was kind of, maybe to be honest, trying to avoid that whole discussion, so I don't have a quick answer to that right now. But it's yeah. Sorry, yeah. To be honest, I was
have to leave it there because we have a few minutes and many people in the queue. Adina, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so this might be not a particularly crisply formulated question, but I'm wondering whether there's room for error in your view. So, for instance, the quote from Jackie Sullivan at the end sort of suggests that We use these concepts in designing our experiments. We look for the answers in terms of those concepts. Is this kind of a self-ratifying system where we could never be wrong about the concepts? And if that's true, what does that say about the realism question?
Yeah, thank you. That's there's absolutely room for error, and this was I tried, but I think it went by very fast. But yes, that is a question I want to be able to address. It's on this slide 15 where I said, how could we be wrong about cognitive kinds if they're created by us? And I think I just kind of very briefly indicated that there are kind of two possible answers. One is that, of course, there might also be normative reasons for questioning some of the causal assumptions we make that sustain a given kind in our folk psychological practices. So that's one way in which there might be room for error, but obviously that's not a purely descriptive question. There's a second way in which there's room for error, which I think is just because we have certain kinds that work in folk psychology, there might still be scientific error about how the capacity in question is realized or actualized. Like, for example, I might have a particular assumption about certain brain areas being responsible for certain kinds of memory, but then later it is revealed that actually it's to do with certain processes of encoding and retrieval. So yes, I think there is room for error, quite briefly.
Thanks, Uljana. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Uljana, for a lovely talk. I wanted to go to the conclusion about the maintaining via the practices and the conceptual use. I wanted to know if a consequence of your view is that if the conceptual and causal practices diverge, is that an indication that we should disentangle two kinds? For example, work in consciousness on different kinds of consciousness that has separately informed distinct fields. Is that a good reason to kind in this case? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. So I think the way that I had intended it was to say that there are certain causal consequences, things that follow causally from our concepts. And of course, on that notion, they can't really diverge. But what you're bringing up is like, what if we find that there are actually, that there are causal differences that are not captured by our current concepts? And I think that gets us back to my discussion earlier on about the Karl Craver's dissociation principle and the question of, well, does it automatically follow that we should split a kind just because we find a causal difference? And I guess I was arguing that it doesn't necessarily follow, but I think you're kind of putting this question back on the table. And I guess my hunch is that this is not kind of a question that can be answered with a principle. One would probably have to look at the specific case. By the way, David, just because you're there, I wanted to say I'm thanking you on the last slide because you're one of the people that have discussed a previous version of this, but you may have noticed it's very different now.
Great, thank you guys. JP, the floor is yours.
Hi, sorry, can you see me?
We can.
Okay, so thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm very sympathetic to the whole organism perspective, and I'm very interested in integrating that with neuroscience. But I was surprised that you brought up, Jackie, or you thought that your framework could mesh with how she sees neuroscience, because she's defended, a stronger role for representations in neurobiology. And neural representations are something that a lot of people might want to treat as their own, as subpersonal cognitive kinds in their own right, which would, directly clash with the whole organism way that you're approaching it. So I guess I was just curious if you could say more about how you think this perspective could fit with a neuroscientific account, and especially someone like Jackie's?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Great question. Well, she may or may not agree with the way I read her, but one reason why I thought there was a fit. Well, one reason is because in the one paper that I cite, she actually talks about the kinds of psychology, or the cognitive kinds being capacities. So that I thought was a good fit. But then you're right, there's this other paper where she talks about, or several other papers where she talks about the importance of representation. But that is actually precisely one of the ways in where I see a parallel, because representations are representations of something. And you might be thinking of the paper where she says, we should take an intentional stance towards our kinds, and when we're doing neuroscientific research. Well, if we have an organism that's embedded in an environment, then it's kind of intentionally directed towards an environment. I think that's getting at a similar intuition. That one of the things that you're going to be positing as part of your explanation of the capacity are going to be representations. So that's kind of how I see the connection.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. I think we must stop here. Thank you, Uljana, for this wonderful talk. It was a real pleasure to have you with us today. And we're going to move to the second talk of this meeting, which is going to be given by Andrea Stocco, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington. He's also the co-director of the Cognition and Cortical Dynamics Laboratory, also at the University of Washington. He's done a lot of work on mental representation, such as rules, plan, and how they influence behavior and how they can be found or identified in the brain. Andrea, the floor is yours. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Let me see if I can successfully replicate the test that we've done before with the screen sharing. And please confirm that you can actually indeed see my title slide.
Something. Here we go.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Just to be extra careful, well, I think I can leave my camera on. So far, it doesn't seem to be interfering. Well, thank you very much for inviting. It's kind of like humbling to come to this series of talks, and coming immediately after Russ Poldrack and Uljana, because these are really talks of a great sophistication. And I'm gonna come and just bring a little bit of my perspective as a neuroscientist. And I really hope that you're gonna give me a little bit of feedback on these ideas that I've been munching on for a few years now. And these ideas comes with a little bit of a dissatisfaction with the work that we've done in neuroscience in the past years, and of which I'm responsible as well. And they come from this naive ontological approach that when we are looking for a cognitive function in the brain, we're just looking for some form of local computation that happens somewhere in the brain. And we can be really fancy in the neuroscience community about the local computation, sometimes developing very sophisticated models or very sophisticated interpretations of what can go on. Sometimes developing very clever behavioral paradigms, as Russ Poldrack said last week. But there are some very naive assumptions that we do sometimes. And as I said at the beginning, I'm responsible for some of them as well. And in fact, I don't want to accuse any of my colleagues. This is actually probably the worst of my assumptions. I put it here on display. This is an attempt to look for some kind of linguistic computations happening in the brain in one particular area that is of interest to me. And I don't think it was a bad assumption, but looking back, I would say that there are some levels of naivety in doing this type of work that 6 years later I would not do. And what has changed since then is not that I believe that the work was bad, but I believe that the entire approach should be refined in some way. In particular, I came to the conclusion that if we want to really look for some kind of ontology, some functions that we believe are true and not true in the brain, and they can help us understand how the brain works in general, we should go back to some of the foundations of really cognitive science. And I like to go back to this old picture of Neil and Simon playing chess. And really, I would like to focus on the chess part, because it's an elegant metaphor in many ways of what we're trying to do. And when we look at chess, there are really two ways to look at the pieces that are on board on the chess. One is to look at actually what the piece is doing in terms of like the rules of the game. The piece, of course, like a piece like knight, is a very complicated set of rules that define where the piece can go and where it cannot go. But the other piece, which is actually a little bit like more sophisticated and is more intuitively close to what we consider a function, is actually how we use this particular piece. And for instance, here we have two different uses of the knight at different levels of the game. Once at the beginning of the game, you see like the knight being used to defend the center of the game, center of the chessboard. And one, at the end of the game, you use the knight to actually create to end the game as a checkmate. Now, this is really interesting because it maps very nicely, in my view, to what we would call like computation, the basic rules of some neuronal populations firing and what they react to, and function, what we describe as, for instance, the higher level pieces of cognition, the working memory, the long-term memory. And I think that there is an important topic that we overlook, that we often overlook, that the difference between computation and function is not only the difference between different levels of description, but it's also the fact that when we look at the function of a particular piece in chess and of a particular region in the brain, it depends on where you are in the game and also of all the other pieces that are deployed at any point in time. So I kind of believe that it's kind of like a naive structuralist approach. There's nothing new, especially for philosophers in this way of thinking. But when you look at the cognitive function in terms of local computation, you really cannot get to the truth unless you really appreciate not only what a region or a set of regions or a network of neurons in the brain are doing, unless you also appreciate or have an idea or an understanding of what other regions are doing at the same time together with this one. And a classic, but I think very relevant way of thinking about this relationship with other regions is to think of them in terms of a cognitive architecture. And this is a very, very old term that has seen like a resurgence recently in both artificial intelligence and cognitive neurosciences, because it comes down to this idea that, to Satya in a way, a piece or a neural circuit really is meaningful because it collaborates with other pieces in the game. Now, cognitive architectures have a long, long history in the cognitive sciences. This is like a diagram for like an overview of the cognitive sciences. On the left-hand side, you can see the development of some cognitive architectures that goes back to the early 70s. And on the right-hand side, you can see the ones that are currently used and the number of papers that are currently assigned to each of them. And you can see that some of the most used ones, like Atari and Sora, are actually the ones that were really proposed early on, and they are still being used. What is really interesting is not the cognitive architecture is still useful, but actually they are among probably the most progressive and incremental field of research that has been done in the cognitive sciences. So just to give you an idea of what I mean by this, I try to track the development of Atari and Sora over about 3 decades, at least 2 decades and a half of development. This is, I try to put like the different characteristics of Atari and Sora and different assumptions in a kind of multidimensional scale, in this kind of abstract space. It's just like tracking down the principle of the architectures. And this is how they were in 1993. So they have very different approaches to representing things, whether the basic computations of the brain or the mind at the time, there was even no connection to the brain, and whether the principles of organizing knowledge and so on. Now, let's flash forward to 2016 when I did this analysis. And you can see that first, Sora actually gave birth to a different architecture called Sigma. Atari and Sora had devolved to a point where in terms of like basic components, they're almost overlapping. They are really similar. And this is a consensus that has led other researchers later on to theorize that cognitive architectures have pretty much come to what they call a standard model of the mind or a common model of cognition, like a set of core fundamental assumptions that almost nobody in the field seems to be discussing anymore, and everybody seems to be implicit in this technology. And these assumptions, roughly speaking, could be diagrammed like this. There is any kind of like intelligent cognitive system, whether it's artificial or human-like, has, roughly speaking, a long-term memory store, that learns knowledge-based memory roughly using Bayesian estimates. A set of rules that we can call procedural memory, that is learned and refined through reinforcement learning. A working memory space that uses short-term contextual representations, and of course, a set of perception and action. This is a very simple idea, and it's I can say like a very elementary set of consensus rules. And I think it can be used as a basis for a very preliminary ontology. What I really like about it is the architectural part, right? Every piece of this simple ontology has a place with respect to the other ones. One of the ideas that is intriguing to me is that this is general enough that can be applied to different domains. It also applies to both human-like intelligence, but also like AI, robots, different type of things. It's minimal, so it doesn't carry too much assumptions. It doesn't have like any kind of like fastidious axiomatic approach that sometimes is used in AI or symbolic AI. It also doesn't come with too much like of a full-fledged platform. And it can be used as a starting point for a cognitive ontology. So what I'm going to pitch here, and then what I tried to do in the past year and a half with my colleagues, is an approach to coming to a consensus ontology that can actually be useful and iterative and come to like as close as possible asymptotically to like a true ontology for the cognitive science by using this refinement approach. You start with an idea for what could be an architecture, a possible set of components that actually have a relationship to each other that is definable, maybe not at the beginning much sophisticated, but clear. And then you can go and refine the components as you go by testing whether these relationships hold or not, and whether there are ways to specify them further. And of course, this comes down to two parts, testing the architecture and refining them. So I'm going to show you like two examples of this approach, and I'm really looking forward to see whether you believe in this approach and you have any comments about this. So testing the architecture is a really, was for us a really interesting challenge because we had no immediate way to do it. So we decided to proceed with the idea of using functional connectivity as the best proxy to test a general purpose brain architecture. The idea of functional connectivity, of course, is that if you can split, you can run this kind of imaginary thought experiment of pulling apart the brain into a finite set of regions, and then analyze the time course of each region independently. What you find out is that there are strong correlations, even when the brain is at rest, between each of these components. This is a famous paper, one of my favorite ones, by Iterative and others from Nature Neuroscience. And these patterns of correlations really tell you something about the natural networks that occur inside the brain, which is probably the best way to come up from the bottom up to a cognitive architecture. This coordinating activity pretty much gives us the idea that there's a limited and actually really small number of functional networks. They're also very sensitive to individual differences. So if you can characterize these networks, you also know how individuals differ. They're kind of like the fingerprints, the basic building blocks of how individuals represent tasks and perform in everyday life. So we thought the functional connectivity was actually probably the best way to come down to testing our functional architecture and our ontologies. Of course, like the problem is like mapping these ideal components like working memory, long-term memory, procedural memory to these networks. But we're roughly in the same game plan, right? Because we have like 5 components in this ideal architecture and about 10 to 15 components in these networks of the brain. And the mapping sometimes is really straightforward. Like there is actually really temporal lobe, semantic and retrieval length memory network. Working memory can be easily assumed to map to the frontoparietal network. Procedural memory can be associated with the basal ganglia network and subcortical regions. And of course, there are multiple networks that are associated with perception in the brain, and at least like a widespread set of networks for motor and coordination and motor planning in the brain. So we could come up with like a set of like systems in the brain that correspond to these hypothetical components and test whether the connection between these components corresponds to the truth of this system in the brain or not. To do that, actually, we look back to the biggest and best high-level data set of fMRI data that exists in the world, the Human Connectome project, which is a collection of 1,200 adult participants' fMRI data, performing 7 different tasks and 4 resting state sessions. And actually, for a subset of them, we have also like MEG data. We did not analyze that. In fact, we did not even analyze all of this data. We analyzed at the beginning only 200. Now we analyze 300, but I'm not going to show the full data from 200 now. And only 6 or 7 different tasks. One task was actually excluded because it gave us some problems. And this is like the gold standard of excellence in fMRI data in many ways. This is really like the highest quality data that we can think of nowadays. So this is really like the best way to test a cognitive architecture in the world of neuroimaging nowadays. And these are the tasks. So the reason we excluded the motor task is because it was by far the least informative. It really comes down to literally small differences between the motor components that are really not important for this high-level ontology that we come up with. So really focus on the emotional cognition, the gambling task, the language task, the relational reasoning task, the social cognition task, and the working memory task. And these tasks were explicitly picked up to cover a good enough range of domains that would be important in the cognitive sciences. Of course, like every choice is questionable, but the coverage we realized was like wide enough to test whether an architecture like this could be considered valid in many ways. And by valid, we hypothesized that a good architecture, like the common model cognition, should meet 2 criteria. And the first criteria is what we call superiority. If it's really a good architecture, and if it's really a good test, a good platform to start defining an ontology, it should provide a better account of brain activity than any other alternative architecture. This is a simple criteria. We don't know, we don't have a criteria to see if this is true, but we can have a criteria to say if this is better. The other is generality. If this is really something that is true of the human brain, it shouldn't matter whether we test it on a particular task or another task. It should be good independent of the task that we use. In fact, it should be good even if we test it without a task in rest and test sessions. Of course, like at this point, we need to find a way to decide how to test this. And what are the alternative competitors in architecture? For alternative architectures, we decided to collect like a bunch of competitors. If you look at the neurosciences, there are many alternative big, large brain scales architectures being proposed. A review of the proposed architectures makes it very clear that they fall into 2 big, like large beams. One is what we call the hub and spoke architectures. Some of them are literally called hub and spoke. And they come with the idea that there is a central hub. Sometimes the central hub is supposed to be the prefrontal cortex. Sometimes it's supposed to be other subcortical regions like the basal ganglia or other cortical regions like the temporal lobes. But generally speaking, they propose that there's a central hub and everything else is like centered around it. Other architectures are hierarchy architectures. They propose that there is a feed-forward or a mixture of feedback and feed-forward architecture that goes from like a low-level pre-processing systems to high-level action selection systems in the brain, and everything like follows in this path somehow. So it was really easy to create different architectures, but basically setting some constraints of what could or could not be a hub or could or could not be like a top and end point of this hierarchy, and then just rotating different regions, different components of this preliminary architecture in the different places of these alternative architectures. And we came up with these different models. Like, so here on the left-hand side, you have 2 examples of each of the 2 hub and spoke and hierarchical families. And on the right-hand side, here, you have our initial architecture, the common model of cognition. So now we have a set of like 7 architectures, and we can perform our 2 tests for the superiority and generality criteria. And to do this test, we cannot do traditional neuroimaging analysis. We actually need to test something that has to do with the network and the relationship between the different components. So we cannot use the traditional general linear model analysis. So we use something slightly different. But there's something different could be considered like a variation of the general linear model, but on steroids. So in the general linear model, you have 2 different like postulated like conditions in the task, x1 and x2, and you just assume that they affect every part of the brain at the same time, and you just calculate a statistical effect, a beta value, that tells you how much is the effect of this particular task condition on this particular part of the brain. In this different approach, dynamic causal modeling, we use a system level, like a dynamic system approach. So we calculate, first we calculate how much, well, first we actually assume that not everything can affect everything in the brain. So there are start and end points for every single condition. For instance, in this hypothetical example, like 2 conditions affect only region Y1. Then we can also assume that there's a particular network. So regions are not connected randomly. They are actually connected according to a particular connectivity pattern. And the connectivity pattern is our network, our preliminary architecture. And of course, like there are modulatory effects. So a task condition may not directly affect a region, but may affect how 2 regions sync with each other. A region may also affect not another region, but how another region sync with each other. And finally, all of these parameters can be estimated independently by using a dynamic system equation. Basically, how each of these factors affects the rate of change in the time series of brain activity that we can record. This is just like a more complicated version of the traditional general linear model. It requires a bit more of calculations, but it can still be done, and it will still spit out parameters that are meaningful and can be used to compare different architectures. To compare, there are different ways to do it. Russell Pollack last week talked a lot about information criteria like AIC, BIC, and log likelihood methods. Here, because for various reasons, actually, but mostly because we're concerned about increased variability across subjects, we use a Bayesian approach. It basically comes down to estimating like the probability or probability distribution that a particular architecture would best fit a participant, given the data. And when you have these probability distributions, you can calculate 2 measures to compare a particular architecture against the other. One is the expected probability, which is just the mean of the probability distribution. And the other is the exceedance probability, how much this particular probability distribution is superior, greater than the mean value of the other probability distributions. And if you look at the comparison of all the other regions, you can clearly see that across all tasks, you can see the 6 top quadrants of this plot. The common model, which is the red probability distribution, is clearly the one that fits the best. It is superior, which is shown by the fact that this probability distribution is shifted to the right in all of the 6 different tasks. We also ran a sanity test by combining all the tasks in a single kind of like Uber task to make sure that there was not something that was specific to the single task conditions, and whether we put them all together so to test like the flexibility of the model in many ways. The common model condition was not underperforming compared to any of the other architectures, but in fact the model overperformed. And the final plot here, unfortunately my pointer disappeared, but you can see it as the last plot that is like a series of red pinkish bars, is the exceedance probabilities, and it leaves no doubt about the fact that the common model is by far the best architecture we can start with. Now, we have shown that this architecture fits the 2 criteria, superiority and generality, but now how can we use it to actually refine our initial assumptions for the ontology? This is the part that is probably the most interesting to me personally, but probably to all of us. Because it goes to the problem, like going back to the whiteboard in many ways, and deciding whether our initial assumptions about what is like procedural memory, what is working memory, and so on, were correct or not, and how they fit, and how these functions fit with the other function we have hypothesized. So in this case, we decided to do a test with what was probably the low-hanging fruit for us, and it was the particular case of procedural memory. So I want you to look a little bit more at this diagram. It's a very simple diagram. And one thing that really stands out is that in this diagram, all the components are pretty much connected equally well or in the same exact way with each other and with working memory. What stands out to me is that there is really an asymmetry between procedural memory. There should be an asymmetry between procedural memory and all the other ones, because we know in many ways that this happens to be true of the neural circuit that we've used as an instantiation of procedural memory. Specifically, when we decide to transform procedural memory and working memory into networks of the brain and use these networks as a test for our functional connectivity analysis, we just bidirectionally connected them. we decided that procedural memory affects working memory and working memory affects procedural memory. These two networks just affect each other in the same way. We know that this is not really what's happening. And decades of computational modeling on the basal ganglia, I put here two examples from more than a decade ago. One is from me and one is from Michael Frank and Randy Riley. It showed that actually what the basal ganglia do through reinforcement learning is actually akin to controlling or opening gates that modulate the cortical connections that eventually feed into prefrontal cortex or the frontal parietal networks. And really, this is not captured well by our network. So we decided that probably we need to refine our initial assumption, our initial ontology, and our initial role of this particular component, the green component, the procedural model component, in a better way. And so we decided to test the hypothesis that a modification of the original relationship of how the procedural model fits within this original architecture would be a better way to make the architecture work. So we remove the connection that goes from procedural memory to working memory and replace it with two modulatory connections. And these two modulatory connections basically affect our perception and long-term memory, a feed into working memory. And here you have the two equivalent diagrams in the original architecture box and in the equivalent brain diagram box. So now we're going back and we are refining what we believe is the function of the procedural memory and the equivalent diagram that we're going to test in the brain. Now, to do this test, we could go back to the original data, but we decided to do a little bit more of a daring test. We decided actually to get patient data because in many ways it's more fun, but it's also a harder test. And we decided to look at Parkinson's disease. And the reason would be obvious and would be immediately obvious if you're familiar with Parkinson's disease. So this is actually the progression of Parkinson's disease from having a healthy situation on the left-hand side to having a full-blown case of Parkinson with symptoms. And you can see that there is a part of the brain that goes from very hot in this, kind of like type of thermal imaging to basically like disappearing. The part of the brain that is actually affected here is actually the basal ganglia, our part of the brain that was assumed to be the procedural model or the equivalent, the neurological counterpart of the procedural model. And what we're tracking here is actually the dopamine, the kind of like the fuel that makes reinforcement learning go and that gives rise to the computation of the basal ganglia. So Parkinson's disease is caused by a chronic lack of dopamine due to the loss of neurons that produce this neurotransmitter. And as the disease progresses, more and more neurons die and the symptoms become more and more apparent. So it is kind of like the best way to test this because as we observe lack of dopamine and as we notice the symptoms progress, we should see the network architecture that we hypothesize go down in fit. And we should also see the decrease in how our hypothetical function works with the rest of the architecture. There's no other way to test this than to redo our analysis and comparing healthy controls with Parkinson's disease at patients. And that's exactly what we do. We also actually had an initial challenge. Instead of using task data, in this case, we use resting state data, which is the state of the art for a type of data for clinical neuroscience. It's kind of like pure data, if I can be let to use this expression, which I know many clinical colleagues would find horrible, but it's not confounded by assumption about what people are doing in a particular task list. And it's really useful because the spontaneous coordinated low frequency for operational activity seems to be very diagnostic of cerebral disease. It also let us play around with different bilateral regions. In the previous data they showed, actually, most of the regions were left lateralized because that's what a task activity looks like. And this is how we created this particular resting state. We created low frequency regressors, 8 of them, to simulate these low frequency fluctuations. We fed them to our components, and we then resimulated their particular network connections. And then we conducted our analysis. This time we created like our ROIs. We were very careful in making sure that these regions were uniquely identified based on the neural anatomy of every single individual in our cohort. We had 65 patients and 40 controls. And you see here the dots represent where this particular region was located for every single person. And they were manually identified in this case. And we compare only two configurations, the original configuration and the modulator configuration. And our idea is the modulator configuration should be better. Not only should be better, but if you estimate the parameters, we also expect that the parameters for the Parkinson patients should be significantly different and should be more negative. And should be more negative for reasons that I'm not going to go into, but they are related to what dopamine does in this particular part of the brain. So this is the first thing that I want to show you. The first is actually a comparison of the two models. In this case, I'm going to show you, we did the same analysis before, but I'm going to show you log likelihood analysis because it's a more direct comparison, and it will immediately give you the idea of what we found. If you look at the Parkinson's disease patients, the difference between the two models is much smaller than the difference between the two models in controls, which means that the network, the original set of functions that we hypothesized for patients, the difference between the two models is not as big. And somehow our original ontology that we hypothesized for the function is not working as well because this part of the circuit is compromised in patients. Well, of course, like we find that in the modulatory case for controls, the modulatory model fits much better. In case of log likelihood, higher values, less negative values indicate a better fit. We can also do a corresponding test. There is also something called a chi-square test that is basically a way to test the significance of the two comparisons. And you can notice in this case that in both cases, the modulatory fits better, but in the case of controls, the fit is much better and is significantly different than the difference in the PD patients. We can also look at what the parameters look like in the brain for patients and controls, and explicitly how they look like for the two types of connections that we saw. And in both cases, we have the probability distributions for the two parameters, again, estimated using our Bayesian method. And we found significant differences, highly significant differences in both cases. So we see that Parkinson patients, as hypothesized, have way more negative parameters, which is, again, something that we imagine is correlated with the function of dopamine. Okay, I'm finally reaching the end of my talk, and I just want to pitch these three lessons that are lessons that we learned in this past year working with this framework of cognitive architectures, functional connectivity in the brain. The first one is that actually cognitive function, which is kind of like the building blocks for these ontologies that we all assume as neuroscientists will go investigate what a part of the brain does, do not exist in a vacuum. They depend on many assumptions, including what we are measuring, what the behavioral task is doing, and so on. But most importantly, they depend on what other brain regions are doing at that point in time. It's really impossible to test a cognitive function for a brain region without having an idea of what the rest of the brain is doing. And this is the invariant context that we need to keep in mind. It's really impossible to know whether an architecture is true. I'm not a strong believer that we're going to solve the problem of the architectures by just crunching bottom-up data, but we know that architectures can be tested and compared. And we know that these tests can be done, and sometimes, luckily, they give us very good answers. Once we have an architecture, we can ask better questions about the functions, and we can refine our initial ontologies and go from like an implicit and naive assumption about what these functions are to a more explicit and less naive, I hope, assumption about what these functions could be within the brain. And that's it. I just want to thank the army of incredible collaborators and students that helped me in this past year. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk. We already have questions. So again, I'm going to be moving you from the status of attendee. So Linus, there are two of you. So I'll move two of you. I'm not sure what that really means, but all right. Linus, the floor is yours. Wonderful. Please. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm not sure if you guys can hear me or not.
I can hear you.
Okay, hi, sorry. So my question is about the model you were testing. So we know that the basal ganglia is actually gating a lot of different function in the brain, but I see in your model, you only assume that it was gating two of the connections. So I'm just wondering what was the motivation behind that choice, and why wasn't it assumed to gate, for example, working memory output and action selection for the motor function?
That is a good question. It goes back. The reason for this particular choice goes back to the original statement I made, that really, when we are testing a function, really are testing a function within an architecture. So if you look at this particular architecture, what we are looking for signals that would feed into our pretty much prefrontal regions, or the equivalent of prefrontal regions. And these signals in our naive identification at the beginning could only come from like the temporal lobe and from the perceptual regions. So the only things that could be gated are really the signals that would go from like lower level perceptual regions or temporal lobe regions. So we decided to restrict the connections at the beginning only in these two. But your point is really a good one. Again, we have a point of selecting between different regions and choosing between different interpretations of what this gating mechanism is. And we could have, for instance, added another interpretation, which also the working memory to action process is modulated. We voted against after many discussions, but that is another instantiation, another way in which we can refine our ontology, for instance.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Joe, the floor is yours.
Hi, can you guys see and or hear me?
We can.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Dr. Stocco, for a fascinating talk. My question is, it seems like your approach in general is making some assumptions about the relationship between functional connectivity and some kind of information processing between regions. So, you know, if I just look at intrinsic connectivity maps in a network architecture, I can see that there are regions of the brain that I know communicate with each other in some sense, but do not have, at some given threshold, strong functional connectivity relationships between them. So I'm just curious about what are the assumptions you're making about the relationship between functional connectivity and there being an exchange of information or some other cognitive relation between the regions.
Yeah, this is a really good and kind of like technical question. So the answer is actually needs to be two-pronged. So there are actually 2 points at which functional connectivity comes into this approach. Let me go back to my slides. This is the first point, right? And this is like the canonical functional connectivity approach. And we use this to really just define and split the brain into macro regions that we can use to look for like points that we can identify with the components, like big regions, essentially. At a certain point, this becomes a matter of, as you call it, thresholding. But in many ways, this becomes, for us, a way of aggregating different voxels, in essence, into big areas, which will be the equivalent here of what I think this is the categorization was actually done by Power in 2010, the different colored regions. The assumptions about what is happening under the hood and how these regions are influencing each other comes at this point in how the activity in one region affects the other one. And here, the reason why we use Causal Modeling is because we wanted this to be as neutral as possible. So this is just like a giant linear system in essence. So when there is like a change in the activity in one region and the entire region is modeled as a single time series, there is an effect that we're going to record at some point in time later on in another region. And this is going to reverberate across the network. So among the many limitations of this approach is that there are no differences across different parts of the network, and there is no assumption about the representation that goes on. We have no way, as of now, of dealing with either of these two representations. And that's the reason why I pitched this at the beginning. Like, this is like a very simple way to capture architectures. There are lots of things that a true architecture should include, like differences within a network and representational assumptions that we cannot just model at this point.
So thank you. And just really quickly, if you'd be willing to follow up. So when you are talking about, say, the difference between a hierarchical model and a different model, is the hierarchical model a temporal pattern of a back and forth between the units defined in the beginning?
Really good point. The hierarchical model is actually, the architecture defined in terms of the spatial distribution of the regions, and not in terms of the temporal component. Among the parameters that actually are estimated in this dynamic network, in this dynamic system, there are also parameters about the timing. So it's actually possible, although unlikely, that a region could have an effect on another region that is because of the latencies in the bold response seen in the response a little bit later. So we don't do something like Granger causality, just estimating the temporal latency or something like this. We just structure the network and we see what is the thing, what is the set of parameters that more likely generate this.
Thank you so much.
Very welcome. Thank you for these questions.
All right, we have time for one other question, maybe, if someone want to raise a question. No taker just now. Let me ask a quick clarification question, something I'm sure you've done in other work, but if I understood the comparison between architectures, you help fix the nodes, right? What was varying was the connections between and the relations between the nodes, right? So you had 6 or 7 nodes, I don't exactly remember, and sometimes you had a specific fixed series of causal connection, sometimes reciprocal causal connection. That was what was varied amongst, I think, the 7 models that you fitted to the data, at least in the study you presented, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so have you done also further work where, in a sense, now I understood that you started with the ITO paper 2016 that you cited there as a way of identifying maybe the node or the main, the main area, and then look at the connection. But have you done some further work when you try to, in a sense, fit models with more nodes, and possibly, other constructs that remain to be determined, or that kind of things?
Yes. So there is the answer is yes. We've tried, but there are some limitations in the pretty much like we ran against the data sprang against the wall very quickly. The first is like computational. So after you add a certain number of nodes, the problem becomes exponentially so complicated computationally that we could not find a solution in computationally tractable times. And this number was unfortunately very small, like 8 or 9 nodes were enough to drive us into panic. There is a general problem with, of course, the other meta problem that we have is that if we want to compare architectures, it is essential that those architectures, they can vary across all dimensions, but they need to have exactly the same nodes. Because any kind of comparisons is predicated on the data that needs to be compared being exactly the same across architectures. And the data always is of course, new imaging data, so it needs to come from some calculation, some extraction of data from the same regions. The other thing that we found out is that if you try to do the reverse and try to extract regions, for instance, or extract architectures from the unconstrained matrices of correlations, which is something that is actually where we started originally from this approach here, you run into a different kind of problem. It's fairly easy to identify networks because the clusters that you see replicate very easily across different studies and across different modalities. But to identify something like, for instance, like, oh, okay, the blue region projects to the red region, and then there is a network that projects to the purple region, and so on, becomes more complicated because every single method that we have tried that would lead us to do this gives different answers based on very small differences in assumptions. And this is the point at which we decided, like, okay, maybe the best way to do it is to start top down and not bottom up.
Thank you.
And really,
that's really helpful. Thanks. I think we have already reached 3 p.m. So I'd like to thank our today's two speakers, Uljana and Andrea, and thank you again for your participation. I'm sure the attendees who can't clap but are also very grateful for these two wonderful lectures. And we'll be again live in a week for the next seminar meeting with a talk by Mike Anderson, again on Monday next week at 1:30 p.m. If you haven't registered for that talk, please go to the website and register following the link on the website. Thank you very much, and thanks again for these wonderful lectures.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.